Snow fell thickly, blanketing the road leading out to the suburban bus station. Flurries drifted gently in the air, clinging to the crooked tin roof of the shelter, where the dim yellow street lamp flickered as if it might go out at any moment. The cold wind, sharp as a blade, sliced through every gap in the thin wedding dress Odessa Hartley was wearing. The gown, once resplendent with pristine white lace, was now smeared with mud, the hem torn to shreds, just like her state of mind. She sat huddled on the freezing metal bench, arms wrapped tightly around herself, knees drawn to her chest to hold on to the last bit of warmth. Her satin bridal shoes were soaked through, stuck to her numb feet. Her hair, once elaborately braided with loose curls, was now a tangled mess like a bird's nest, a few strands plastered to her cheeks by melted snow and tears. Her bright blue eyes, usually lit with a radiant smile, now looked dull, sunken with fear and exhaustion. Her lips were bluish, trembling not just from the winter night's chill, but from the panic still churning in her chest. In her left hand, she clutched an old phone, battery nearly dead, SIM card removed the moment she'd fled the church. Her right arm held a small purse, containing nothing but a crumpled, worn photo of her and her mother, taken back when she still knew how to smile without forcing it. Odessa didn't dare lift her head. Every sound, the distant blare of a horn, the wind whistling through the trees, the dry leaves rustling under the snow made her flinch, as if Damon Hawk might appear at any second. He was always like that, always knowing where she was, what she was doing, what she was thinking. He had installed cameras in her apartment, checked her messages, frozen her bank accounts. "You belong to me," he had once told her, his voice sweet but cold as a verdict. And now, after she had run away just before the wedding, she knew he wouldn't let her go easily. He would find her. He always did. She whispered to herself, her voice so weak the wind nearly swallowed it. "I have to keep going. Have to." But where? She had no money, no one to call for help. Her family, her mother and sister were under Damon's threats. He'd made it clear, if she left him, they would pay the price. Terror squeezed her chest until every breath hurt. She closed her eyes, trying to push away the image of Damon in his black suit, standing before the altar, those cold eyes scanning the crowd the moment he realized she was gone. In the distance, the headlights of a vehicle cut through the white curtain of snow. The low rumble of an engine grew louder, then slowed as the car approached the bus station. Odessa froze, heart pounding. She lowered her head even further, wet hair covering her face, praying the car would just drive by. But it stopped right in front of the shelter. The door opened, and the sound of leather shoes crunching on the snowy pavement rang out, clear as a bell. Odessa didn't dare look. She clutched the phone tighter, as if it could protect her. Footsteps came closer, slow, deliberate, certain. A tall figure stopped in front of her, blocking out the street lamp and casting her into shadow. She bit her lip, fighting back the sob threatening to break free. Damon had found her. She trembled, consumed by fear. "Are you all right?" A deep, slightly husky voice broke the silence. It wasn't Damon's voice. It wasn't that deadly, sugary tone. But Odessa still couldn't look up. She shook her head, the movement so slight it was barely noticeable. The man didn't say anything else. She heard the faint rustle of fabric, then felt a thick coat, still warm from his body, settle over her shoulders. A scent of cedar wood and a hint of men's cologne drifted around her, soothing her shaking, if only for a moment. She slowly raised her head and, for the first time, looked at him. Xavier Carter stood there, tall in a dark gray suit, his jet-black hair tousled slightly by the wind, his deep brown eyes fixed on her with a mix of curiosity and concern. He wasn't the kind of man who looked dazzlingly handsome like Damon, but there was an undeniable pull about him. The chiseled face, a square jaw with a trace of stubble, and eyes sharp enough to see through any lie. His tie hung loose around his neck, as if he'd just left a late meeting. He wasn't smiling, but he didn't seem cold either. He was simply present, like a wall between her and the blizzard. "You can't stay here," he said, his voice calm but firm, as if stating an obvious fact. His gaze dropped to her shredded wedding dress and soaked shoes, then returned to her face. "This isn't a place for a bride." Odessa opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. Don't call the police," she stammered, her voice shaking. Please, he'll find me. Xavier frowned, just slightly but enough for her to see he was thinking it over. He didn't ask who he was, didn't interrogate her. Instead, he crouched down so their eyes were level, a gesture that made her instinctively lean away. I'm not calling the police, and he said, his voice low and steady, but you can't stay here. Not now. She looked at him, searching for any sign of deceit, any hidden trap. But all she saw in his eyes was certainty, no hesitation at all. She didn't know who he was, didn't know why he'd stopped, but there was something in his voice, a silent promise that made her nod, still trembling. Xavier straightened and held out his hand. Come with me, he said, not as a command, but like an invitation. Odessa hesitated, staring at his hand, broad, steady, but not forceful. She drew a deep breath, set her phone and purse on the bench, and took his hand. His grip was warm and solid, an anchor in the storm raging inside her. He led her to the sleek black SUV parked at the curb, opened the door for her. As she settled into the passenger seat, the scent of leather and the heat from the vents wrapped around her. Xavier said nothing more, just started the engine, his eyes fixed on the snow-covered road ahead. But when he glanced at her, just for a moment, Odessa felt something she hadn't in a very long time. Safe. You're watching Soul Stories, where every story whispers of love, healing, and hope. Let us know which city you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and be a part of our journey. Now stay with us. The story is just beginning. The SUV glided along snow-covered roads, headlights sweeping through the white night. Inside the car, the warmth from the heater slowly melted the frost on Odessa's hands, but it couldn't chase away the tremor deep inside her. She sat curled up in the passenger seat, Xavier's coat still wrapped tightly around her shoulders, like a fragile shield against the memories of Damon. Every time the headlights of an oncoming car flashed, she flinched, imagining his figure standing somewhere out there, those cold, sharp eyes tracking her. She glanced over at Xavier, who was driving with absolute focus, his angular face lit by the dim glow of the dashboard. He hadn't spoken a word since they'd left the bus station, and his silence was both comforting and unsettling. Who was he? Why was he helping her? And more importantly, could she trust him? Where are we going? Odessa spoke up, her voice hoarse, almost drowned out by the engine's hum. She bit her lip, regretting that she'd broken the quiet. But she needed to know. She couldn't blindly follow a stranger, even if he'd pulled her from the storm. Xavier glanced at her, his deep brown eyes briefly sweeping over her face before returning to the road. A hotel, he replied, his voice low and clipped. You need somewhere safe to rest, and I need time to figure out what to do next. A hotel. The word sounded too luxurious, too ordinary compared to the nightmare she was living. She nodded, though she wasn't sure she understood. Her hand unconsciously tightened around the phone with the SIM card removed, as if it were the only thing tethering her to the outside world. But that world had become nothing more than a string of Damon's threats. You can't run forever, Odessa. I will find you. The neon sign of the Grand Meridian Hotel glowed brightly through the snowstorm, but when Xavier led her into the main lobby, the warm air and the scent of vanilla diffusers couldn't soothe her panic. The lobby was spacious, with marble floors, red velvet armchairs, and an unplayed piano in the corner. The front desk clerk, a young woman in a navy uniform, gave Xavier a professional smile, but shook her head when he asked for a room. The snowstorm, sir, she said apologetically. We're fully booked. We can check again in the morning, but tonight... Xavier frowned, a sharp line forming between his brows. He nodded, thanked her curtly, and turned to Odessa. She stood a few steps away, her soaked bridal shoes leaving pale wet marks on the floor. The tattered wedding gown clung to her, making her look like a ghost wrapped in white silk. All right, he said, his voice still calm. We'll find somewhere else. But before he could lead her back outside, a sharp sound rang out from his coat pocket. A ringtone, just a simple chime, but to Odessa, it felt like a scream. She recoiled, her back hitting the cold marble wall, eyes wide with terror. No, no, she whispered, clutching her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. It was Damon. She was sure of it. He'd found her. He always did. Xavier pulled out his phone and glanced at the screen. His eyes shifted back to her, recognizing the panic swallowing her whole. His frown deepened slightly, not in anger, but as if he were trying to understand. "Breathe," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's just my colleague." He lifted the phone to his ear and answered briefly. "Rachel, I'm busy. Call back later." Then he hung up, tucked the phone away, and stepped closer to her. Odessa shook her head, her vision blurring with tears. "You don't understand. He knows. He always knows." She slid down to sit on the floor, the wedding dress spreading around her like a pool of dirty white. She covered her face, trying to hold back the sobs, but they broke through anyway, ragged and painful. Xavier crouched in front of her, keeping enough distance so she wouldn't feel threatened, but close enough that she could sense he was there. He looked her straight in the eyes, his deep brown gaze unwavering. "Odessa," he said, calling her name for the first time, his voice steady but gentle. "I don't know who you're running from, but tonight you don't have to face anyone. You're coming with me." His words were like a rope pulling her back from the edge of a cliff. She looked up, her blue eyes meeting his. There was something in the way he looked at her, not pity, not curiosity, but a silent promise. She nodded, still trembling, and let him help her to her feet. Xavier's penthouse was on the top floor of a skyscraper overlooking the snow-covered city. A massive glass wall revealed distant lights twinkling like stray stars. The decor was minimalist yet luxurious. Polished ebony floors, charcoal leather sofas, and an electric fireplace casting a warm glow. But to Odessa, the wide, beautiful space only made her feel smaller. She stood frozen in the doorway, still clutching Xavier's coat, too afraid to step inside, as if touching anything might ruin its perfection or worse, leave traces Damon could follow. "Sit," Xavier said, gesturing to the sofa. He had removed his suit jacket, revealing a crisp white shirt that fit his frame, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He was pouring water from a glass carafe, but his eyes never left her. Odessa shook her head, her voice barely audible. I don't want to dirty." She looked down at her gown, now streaked with mud and melting snow, then at her shaking hands. She felt like she didn't belong here, didn't belong anywhere. Xavier set the glass down and came closer. "You're not dirtying anything," he said softly but firmly. "This is my home, and tonight it's your home." She blinked and tears spilled again, but this time, not from fear. She slowly stepped to the sofa and sat, though her body remained tense, like a small animal ready to bolt. Xavier didn't push her to speak. He just brought her a soft wool blanket, draped it over her shoulders, then walked away, leaving her alone with the fireplace and the city lights. That night, Odessa lay curled on the sofa, the blanket pulled up to her chin. She didn't dare sleep, didn't dare let herself relax. Every small noise, the crackle of the fire, the wind whistling against the glass made her jerk awake, heart hammering. Damon's image hovered in her mind. The false smile, the hand gripping her wrist, the voice whispering she would never escape. But then she looked toward the corner of the room, where Xavier sat in an armchair, reading something on a tablet, its pale blue light illuminating his face. He didn't sleep. He didn't leave. He was there, a silent sentinel. And for the first time in months, Odessa felt a tiny, fragile flicker of hope enough that she finally closed her eyes, if only for a few moments. Morning light slipped through the glass wall of the penthouse, casting pale golden streaks across the polished ebony floors. Outside, snow was still falling, though lighter than the night before, forming a thin veil over the city. Odessa woke up on the leather sofa. The wool blanket Xavier had draped over her the night before now slipped to the floor, revealing her crumpled wedding dress, dry but still stained with mud. She blinked, trying to orient herself, and then the familiar wave of panic hit. This wasn't her home. This was the home of a stranger, a man whose name she barely knew, who had pulled her from the freezing bus station last night. But she couldn't stay. She couldn't let herself become a burden, or worse, drag him into the nightmare called Damon Hawk. She sat up, her hands trembling as she tried to smooth her tangled hair. The room was silent. Only the soft crackle of the electric fireplace and the faint howl of wind outside. Xavier wasn't here. Maybe he had gone out or was in another room. She couldn't hear him, and that made her both relieved and anxious. This was her chance to leave, before he asked more questions, before she accidentally revealed too much and put them both in danger. She stood, her bare feet cold against the floor, and quietly reached for Xavier's coat, still hanging on the rack by the door. In its pocket, she still had the phone with the SIM removed and the empty wallet. They were all she had, and they reminded her that she had nowhere to go. Odessa found a sheet of paper and a pen on the glass coffee table. She wrote quickly, her hands shaking so badly the letters tilted and wavered. "Thank you. I'm sorry for the trouble." She set the note down, folding it so it wouldn't blow away, then stepped toward the front door. Her heart pounded, each step heavier with the fear that Damon was out there somewhere, waiting. But she couldn't stay. Couldn't let Xavier, the man with the steady gaze and the calming voice, be pulled into her spiral. She had just set her hand on the doorknob when a deep voice spoke behind her, making her jump and nearly drop the phone. "Where are you going?" Odessa turned, her heart seeming to stop. Xavier stood in the doorway leading in from the hall, wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. His jet-black hair was a little tousled, as if he'd just woken up, but his deep brown eyes were still sharp, as if he had known exactly what she intended before she even moved. I have to go," she stammered, taking a step back until her shoulders touched the door. "I can't stay here. Thank you, but I don't want to cause trouble." Xavier stepped forward, setting the coffee cup down on the table with slow, deliberate movement, as though he didn't want to startle her. "You don't have to run alone," he said, his voice low but firm, like a statement no one could dispute. He stood a few steps away, close enough that she could feel his presence, but not so close she'd feel cornered. "Sit down. We need to talk." Odessa shook her head, tears rising even as she fought them back. "You don't understand. If I stay, he'll find me. He always finds me." Her voice broke, so faint she hardly recognized it as her own. Xavier frowned, his eyes darkening as if he were trying to piece together the fragments of the story she hadn't yet told. "Who is he, Odessa?" he asked, his voice gentle but patient. He gestured toward the sofa. "Sit down. I won't let anyone hurt you." She hesitated, looking into his eyes. There was something in the way he spoke, not an empty promise, but a quiet conviction that made her slowly step back into the room. She sat on the edge of the sofa, still clutching the phone like a useless talisman. Xavier took the armchair across from her, keeping a distance that let her feel safe. He didn't push her to speak, he only waited, and his silence made it impossible for her to hide any longer. "His name is Damon," she began, her voice unsteady. She bowed her head, staring at her hands, her fingers pale from gripping so tightly. "Damon Hawk. On the surface, he's a wealthy, respectable man, someone everyone admires. But it's just a facade." She took a shaky breath, as if she needed every ounce of courage to keep going. "At first, our relationship started out of love, but over time, he started controlling everything. He installed cameras in my apartment. He read my messages, checked my email, even locked my bank accounts. He said if I ever left, my family would pay." Her voice broke, tears spilling down onto the wrinkled fabric of her wedding dress. "My mother, my sister. He knows where they are. He knows everything." Xavier listened without interrupting. His face grew somber, a quiet storm gathering in his gaze. For a moment, just a flicker, there was something like anger or perhaps recognition in his expression, but he quickly masked it. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes never leaving her. "What did he do to you?" he asked, his voice low but heavy with restrained force, as though he was holding back something much stronger. Odessa shook her head, unwilling to remember, but the images rushed in anyway. Damon's hand clamped around her wrist hard enough to leave bruises, his whispered threats in her ear when she tried to resist, the cold look in his eyes when she said she wanted to leave. "He said I belonged to him," she whispered, her voice choked. "He said no one could help me, and I believed him, until last night." Xavier didn't respond right away. He stood walking over to the window to look out at the snow-covered city below. She watched him, seeing the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand briefly curled into a fist before he forced it to relax. When he turned back to her, his gaze had softened, but it still held an unshakable resolve. "You're not alone anymore," he said, his voice low but certain. "I'm not going to tell you it will be easy, but I promise I won't let him touch you. Not today. Not any day." Odessa blinked, tears sliding down her cheeks. She wanted to believe him, to cling to those words, but fear still gripped her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice as small as a whisper. "You don't know me. You don't have to." Xavier cut her off, not harshly, but firmly enough that she fell silent. "Because I've seen men like him before," he said, his voice dropping, carrying a hint of something dark. "And I know you deserve to be safe." The midday light gradually faded across the glass wall of the penthouse, leaving faint shadows on the polished ebony floors. Outside, snow still drifted lazily down, but the storm from the night before had calmed, leaving the city silent, as if holding its breath. Odessa sat on the sofa, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea Xavier had set in front of her a few minutes earlier. The warmth seeped into her palms but did nothing to ease the tremor in her chest. The shredded wedding dress had been replaced with an oversized sweater and leggings Xavier had pulled from a closet. "My sister's," he'd said, his voice gentle but offering no further explanation. The clothes were baggy, but they made her feel a little less exposed, if only just. She watched Xavier standing near the window, phone pressed to his ear. He wore a white shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms, and his deep voice carried steadily across the room, sharp and precise like a lawyer conducting a case. "Rachel, I need you to check every public and private database. Bank records, phone logs, GPS, anything connected to Odessa Hartley. Find out if anyone is tracking her, especially Damon Hawk." He paused, listening, then added, "Do it fast but discreetly. No traces." Odessa went rigid at the sound of that name spoken aloud by Xavier. She set the cup down on the table, harder than she meant to, sending a little tea sloshing over the rim. "You know Damon?" she asked, her voice a mix of confusion and suspicion. Her heart pounded, as if she'd been thrown back into last night's nightmare. How did he know that name? She'd only told him about Damon this morning, but the way Xavier spoke it with a cold familiarity made her feel there was some hidden truth behind it. Xavier ended the call and turned to face her. His deep brown eyes flickered over her, as if weighing how much to reveal. He stepped closer, sitting in the armchair across from her, elbows resting on his knees, posture both relaxed and controlled. "I know him," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "We worked together a few years ago. A major case. I saw firsthand how he destroys people who have no one to stand behind them." Odessa blinked, trying to process his words. "Work together?" she repeated, her voice unsteady. "You're his friend?" The thought twisted her stomach. If Xavier was Damon's friend, she'd escaped one trap only to fall into another. She sank back into the sofa, her hands clutching the hem of the sweater as if preparing to flee again. "Not his friend," Xavier said quickly, his voice sharper, as if to erase the idea from her mind. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "Damon and I were partners on a legal project. He's the kind of man who hides what he is under a polished facade. I watched him manipulate, threaten, and ruin the lives of anyone who got in his way. I'm not surprised you ran from him." She studied his face, searching for any trace of deceit, but all she found was sincerity mixed with a flicker of anger, not at her, but at Damon. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "If you know how dangerous he is, why risk it?" Xavier was silent for a moment, his gaze shifting to the window where snowflakes still hung in the air. When he looked back at her, something, maybe an old wound, passed across his face before he hid it again. "Because once I couldn't help someone else," he said, his voice dropping, almost harsh, "and I won't let that happen again. I won't let him destroy you, Odessa." His words cut deep, not because they hurt, but because they touched a place inside her she had almost forgotten existed, the place that still believed she deserved to be protected. She lowered her head, tears rising, though she fought to keep them back. "He won't stop," she whispered. "He said if I left, he'd hurt my mother. My sister. He has money, power. I can't fight that. Xavier stood, moving closer, but he stopped at the edge of the sofa, leaving enough space so she wouldn't feel cornered. He knelt down so their eyes were level, a gesture that made her look up involuntarily. He isn't invincible, he said, his voice steady as an oath. He may have money and power, but I have the law, and I know how to use it. I won't let him touch you or your family, I promise. She looked into his eyes, those deep brown eyes like a still ocean, and for the first time, she felt a glimmer of real hope. Not a self-delusion, but a belief that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to run alone anymore. But the fear still clung to her, a shadow she couldn't shake. You don't know how terrifying he is, she said, her voice breaking. He'll find me. He always does. Xavier didn't answer right away. He lifted his hand, hesitated for a moment, then gently set it over hers. His hand was warm and steady, like an anchor in the storm inside her. He'll have to go through me first, he said, his voice low but full of quiet determination. And I don't go down easily. That night, the penthouse lay in darkness, lit only by the dim glow of the electric fireplace and the scattered lights of the city beyond the windows. Odessa lay curled on the sofa, the wool blanket pulled up to her chin, but sleep didn't come. Xavier's words echoed in her mind, tangled with memories of Damon, the false smile, the hand bruising her wrist, the whispered threats in her ear. But this time, something was different. Xavier's promise, simple as it was, had opened a small crack in the wall of fear she'd built around herself. She sat up, hugged her knees, and let the tears fall. Not the hopeless tears of before, but tears of release, as if part of the weight on her shoulders had finally lifted. She sobbed, the sound breaking the quiet of the room, but she didn't try to stop it. Xavier didn't appear, didn't step out of his bedroom, but she knew he was there somewhere in this home, watching over her like a silent sentinel. She wiped her eyes and looked out the window, where the city still glowed despite the storm. And for the first time in months, she felt she might survive this nightmare. Not alone, but with someone standing beside her, even if she didn't yet understand why. Xavier's penthouse was quiet, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock and the soft whistle of wind outside the windows. The dull gray light of a late winter afternoon filtered through the big glass pane, casting a pale glow over Odessa's drawn face. She sat curled on the sofa, clutching the iPad Xavier had left her, its screen displaying a news story that made her heart stop. Missing bride Damon Hawk offers $50,000 reward for information about Odessa Hartley. Her photo in a lavish wedding gown, standing next to Damon at their engagement party, filled the screen. The forced smile she wore in that picture now looked like a warning from the past, a version of herself she no longer recognized. She turned off the screen, but the image was burned into her mind. Damon wasn't just looking for her. He had made her a public target, prey that the entire city now knew by face. She pulled Xavier's oversized sweater tighter around herself, but it couldn't hide the feeling of exposure crawling over her skin. He was out there, with all his money and power, using the media to tighten the noose around her. She pictured the strangers' eyes on the streets, people who would gladly sell her out for the reward. She began to shake, her breath short and fast, as though all the air was draining from the room. Xavier walked in from his study, a file folder in his hand. He wore a dark blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, showing strong forearms. His brown eyes flicked to her, instantly reading the panic on her face. "You saw the news," he said, his voice low and steady, not needing her to confirm. He set the folder down on the table and sat in the armchair across from her. But before he could say more, his phone rang, the sharp tones slicing through the stillness. Odessa flinched, her hand gripping the edge of the sofa. Even though it was only a normal ringtone, it felt like a threat. Xavier glanced at the screen, and his face darkened, a flash of anger crossing it before he smoothed it away. He stood, walking over to the corner near the window, but his voice carried clearly, cold as steel. "Damon," he answered, his tone flat, like naming an adversary in a courtroom. Odessa felt the blood drain from her face. She hugged her knees, trying to swallow her sobs, but couldn't stop herself from leaning forward, listening. Damon's voice came through the speaker, smooth, poisonous, like a velvet-wrapped blade. Xavier, you're as stubborn as ever. Listen, we're old friends. Don't make this messy. Give her back to me, and I'll pretend none of this ever happened. She could picture Damon's smile, that cold, smug grin that had terrified her every time his temper flared. He knew she was here. He always knew. She bit her lip until it hurt, trying to stop the tears, but they spilled over anyway, sliding silently down her cheeks. Xavier stood tall, his back to her, his shoulders tense as steel. "She's not a possession for you to reclaim, Damon," he replied, his voice as sharp as a blade. "And if you think you can control her with money or threats, you've picked the wrong person to challenge." A dry, humorless laugh crackled through the phone. "You always did love playing the hero, Carter. But this time, you're in over your head. Don't make me remind you what the consequences look like." Xavier turned, meeting Odessa's eyes, and she knew he realized she was listening. But he didn't pause. "You want to play? Fine," he said, his tone low and dangerous. "But she's staying with me, and you won't lay a hand on her. I promise you that." The call ended with a hard click. Xavier set the phone down on the table slowly, as though fighting to keep a deeper anger in check. But Odessa could only hear the thundering of her own heartbeat. She shot to her feet, her legs trembling, her voice splintering. "I can't fight him," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He's turned me into a game, something to hunt. He'll never let go. I don't have the strength." Xavier stepped closer, quick but gentle, stopping right in front of her. He bent so their eyes were level, his brown gaze steady like a lighthouse in the storm. "Odessa," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "He's not as powerful as you think. He uses fear to control people, but you don't have to be afraid anymore." Slowly he reached out, wrapping his hand around hers. Her cold fingers were enclosed in his warmth. "I'm here," he went on, voice soft but unshakable. "And I'm not going to let you face him alone. You don't have to beat him by yourself. We'll do it together." She looked at him, her blue eyes blurred with tears. But this time, something small and bright flickered in her chest. His words didn't erase the fear, but they were like a tiny flame, enough to warm a frozen corner of her heart. She squeezed his hand, a fragile but deliberate gesture, as if holding on to a lifeline. After the call, Xavier led her into the kitchen, where the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air. He opened the fridge, took out a container of yogurt and a plate of fruit, and set them in front of her with a simple, caring motion. "You need to eat something," he said, his voice gentle but leaving no room for refusal. "There won't be any battles to fight if you're running on empty." Odessa looked down at the fruit slices of ripe strawberries and bright green kiwi, but her hands still trembled as she picked up the spoon. "What will he do next?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "If he's made this public, he won't stop. He'll find some way to hurt me or you." Xavier sat across from her, his gaze never wavering. "He can try," he said, his tone calm but carrying a cold confidence. "But I've dealt with men like him before. He thinks he can use money and influence to win, but I know how to turn those things against him." She looked up, curiosity and doubt mingling in her expression. "How?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "He has an entire team of lawyers who do anything to protect him." Xavier gave a faint smile, small but meaningful. "He has lawyers," he said, his voice carrying a trace of pride. "But I'm a better lawyer, and I don't just have the law, I have a reason to fight you." She blinked, and for a moment, her tears stopped. His words, simple as they were, made her feel she wasn't just prey anymore. She didn't understand why he was risking so much for her, but in his eyes she saw a commitment that needed no explanation. She nodded, picked up the spoon, and for the first time that day she took a bite of strawberry, tasting its sweet softness on her tongue. Still following the story? If this story found you outside of Soul Stories, we invite you home to where every touching tale begins with truth, hope, and heart. The pale morning light slipped through the linen curtains of the penthouse, settling across the walnut desk where Xavier sat. A stack of documents was neatly arranged in front of him, next to an open laptop displaying emails and financial charts. He wore a white dress shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his gaze focused like a strategist preparing for battle. Across from him, Odessa sat in an armchair, her hands tightly clasped, still wearing the oversized sweater and leggings he had given her the day before. She looked small in the vast space, but her bright blue eyes, though shadowed with worry, now held a flicker of determination. "We need evidence," Xavier said, his voice low and clear, like a lawyer instructing a client in court. He slid a stack of papers toward her, along with a pen and a notepad. "Anything you have, messages, emails, recordings, even instances when Damon froze your bank accounts. Every detail matters. If we want to take him to court, we need an airtight case." Odessa blinked, staring at the papers as if they were something foreign. He, he was very careful," she said, her voice trembling. "He never left much behind. He'd delete messages right after sending them, or call so I couldn't keep records." She lowered her head, her fingers tugging at the hem of the sweater. "But I remember a few times he sent threatening emails saying if I didn't obey, he'd have my mother fired. And my bank account, he froze it the day before the wedding. He said I didn't need money if I was going to be his wife." Xavier nodded, his gaze steady on her, though a subtle tension tightened the way he gripped his pen. "Good," he said, his tone calm but resolute. "Emails are a start. If he froze your account, there will be transaction records or notifications from the bank. I'll have my team look into it. What else? Anything you can remember, no matter how small, tell me." She drew a deep breath, sifting through memories that felt like pages in a dark diary. "There was one time he installed a camera in my living room," she said, her voice fading, as if ashamed to admit it. "He said it was for my protection, but I knew it was to watch me. I don't know if there were any recordings, but I saw him checking it on his phone." Xavier jotted down a note, his face growing darker, a silent anger flickering in his eyes. "Camera," he repeated, his voice low. "If he stored any data, we can track it, and if he invaded your privacy, that's a serious criminal offense." He looked up, his gaze locking on hers. "You're doing very well, Odessa. I know this isn't easy, but every detail you share is a weapon we can use." She nodded, though her heart pounded. The thought of confronting Damon, the man who had turned her life into an invisible prison, filled her with fear, and strangely, a fragile hope. Sitting across from Xavier, hearing the steady conviction in his voice, she realized that for the first time, she might not be completely powerless. By midday, Xavier received a call from Rachel, his associate attorney. "Damon is escalating," Rachel said over the speakerphone, her voice sharp but tinged with concern. "He's hired a PR team to flood the media with the missing bride story. Paparazzi are swarming the city. If she's still there, you need to get her out of the center immediately." Xavier glanced at Odessa, who was standing near the window, staring down at the city with a faraway look. "Understood," he said, his voice low. "I'll handle it. Thank you, Rachel." He ended the call, stood and walked over to her. "Odessa," he said, his tone gentle but firm, "we need to leave. The paparazzi will be here soon, and I don't want you cornered." She turned, her eyes wide with fear. "Leave? Go where?" Her voice shook, but it was no longer the despair of days past. There was something new in her, something like readiness, even if it was fragile. "I have a house in the mountains," Xavier said, already gathering his laptop and files. "It's secluded and secure. We can keep working from there. You'll be safe." She nodded, though worry still creased her brow. "All right," she whispered, then quietly gathered her few belongings, the phone without a SIM card, the empty wallet, and a worn photo of her mother and sister. Xavier watched her, his eyes softening, but he said nothing more, only gestured for her to follow him out to the car. The drive to the mountain house took longer than expected, the snowy roads slick and winding. Xavier's SUV glided past forests of pine, the sunset staining the horizon a deep red, casting the landscape in a serene, imposing beauty. Odessa sat in the passenger seat, watching the world slip by, feeling the distance grow between herself and Damon. The house appeared after a curve, a modern timber cabin with large glass windows nestled among snowy pines and stone outcrops. It looked like the perfect refuge, detached from the world. Inside, the house was warm, with oak floors, a massive stone fireplace, and thick wool rugs. Xavier led her into a cozy living room where the firelight danced across the walls. "You'll stay here," he said, gesturing toward a hallway. "There's a bedroom prepared, and I've arranged some clothes. You'll be safe here." Odessa nodded but didn't move, her hands clutching the photo of her mother and sister. "Thank you," she said, her voice small but sincere. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Xavier gave a faint smile, the first trace of warmth she'd seen on his angular face. "Don't thank me yet," he said quietly. "We're only just beginning." That night, Xavier decided to cook dinner, an effort that surprised her. She sat at the kitchen counter, watching him fuss over a frying pan and a pile of vegetables, looking completely out of place compared to the polished lawyer she had come to know. He dropped a potato, then fumbled with an onion till his brown eyes watered from the sting. "I don't usually do this," he muttered, sounding a little embarrassed when he saw her watching. Odessa couldn't help it. A small smile broke across her face for the first time since she'd run away. "You're a great lawyer," she said, her voice still weak but touched with a hint of teasing. "But as a chef, you might need more practice." Her smile was small and fragile, but it was like a ray of light breaking through the night. Xavier stopped, stared at her in surprise, then smiled back, just a small, gentle curve of his lips. "I'll take that under advisement," he replied, a rare humor in his voice. He slid a plate of slightly overdone chicken and stir-fried vegetables toward her. "Try it. I promise it's not poisonous." She picked up the fork, took a bite, and even though the meal wasn't perfect, it filled her with warmth, not just from the food itself, but from this moment when she could finally smile, even a little, in the middle of the storm that had become her life. The mountain house lay wrapped in darkness as a sudden snowstorm swept in, carrying a howling wind like a ghostly song. The power had gone out, leaving the timber cabin in a hush, broken only by the crackling logs in the fireplace. The orange glow danced across thick wool rugs and oak furniture, casting a warmth that felt both comforting and mysterious. Odessa sat on a rug in front of the fire, her arms hugging her knees, blue eyes reflecting the flames, but still shadowed by a quiet, unshakable dread. She wore a beige sweater and jeans Xavier had prepared for her long hair loosely tied with a few strands falling across her shoulders, making her look both fragile and resilient. Xavier sat a few feet away in an old armchair, the firelight highlighting the sharp lines of his square jaw and the depth in his brown eyes. He held a glass of red wine, but didn't drink it, only turned it slowly in his hand as if lost in thought. The space between them was silent but not awkward. It was the hush of two people who were slowly beginning to understand each other, even without words. Odessa drew a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the flames, but her mind drifted back to another memory. She saw herself in her old apartment, cornered by Damon, his hand gripping her wrist so hard she thought the bones would snap, his hot breath against her face as he whispered threats. "Where do you think you can run?" he had said, voice sweet but as sharp as a blade. "You belong to me, Odessa. Don't make me remind you." She shivered, not from the cold in the room, but from how alive that memory still felt, like a wound that hadn't closed. She wrapped her arms tighter around herself, trying to banish the image, but it clung to her like a shadow she could never outrun. Xavier noticed the change in her. He set the glass down, his expression softening, though alert. "Odessa," he said, voice low and gentle, as if afraid to break the moment. "Are you all right?" She shook her head, tears rising but not falling. I can't stop remembering," she whispered, her voice splintering. There was a time he shoved me against the wall, holding me so hard I thought he'd break my arm. He said I would never escape, and I'm afraid he was right, afraid I'm not strong enough." Xavier slid off the chair and settled beside her on the rug. The firelight painted his face in stark lines, both fierce and warm. "Look at me," he said, steady but not commanding. She lifted her gaze, her blue eyes meeting his, and for a moment she felt as though he could see all the fear she carried. He slowly raised his hand, letting his fingers brush her cheek in a touch so gentle it felt like it might disappear. His skin was warm, in contrast to the cold that still clung to her face. "You're stronger than he ever imagined," he said, his voice low and resolute, as if declaring a truth. "He wanted you to believe you were weak, but you left him. You stood up, even when you were terrified. That is strength, Odessa, and I see it every single day." She blinked and the tears finally spilled, but this time they weren't from pain or fear. His words were like a wind, clearing away a part of the fog that always hung in her mind. She didn't pull away from his touch. Instead, she leaned into it, searching for the warmth and safety it offered. "I don't know how to believe that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But when you say it, I want to." Xavier smiled, a rare, soft smile that lit his usually serious face. "Then believe me first," he said, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. "And one day, you'll see it for yourself." The space between them closed not because either of them moved, but because something invisible was drawing them closer. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to retreat if she needed to, but she didn't. She looked up at him, her eyes locked to his, and when his mouth touched hers, the kiss was gentle and unhurried, full of trust. It wasn't desperate or demanding, but like a promise that she wasn't alone anymore, that he was here, and that together they would survive this storm. She kissed him back, tentative but honest, her hand lifting to rest lightly against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart through his shirt. The kiss lasted only seconds, but it felt like a small eternity, a place where her fear finally went quiet. When they parted, she didn't look away. She held his gaze, their breath mingling in the warm air between them. "I'm not going to promise it will all be easy," Xavier said, voice husky, his hand still resting gently on her cheek. "But I promise I'll be here. Every step." She nodded, tears slipping down her face again, but this time they came with a small, fragile smile. "I know," she whispered, and for the first time, she felt like she might be able to face tomorrow. After the kiss, they sat together for a while longer, quiet but at ease, the firelight flickering across the walls. Xavier finally stood, picked another log from the basket beside the hearth, and fed it into the flames, making them surge brighter. "You should rest," he said, his voice returning to its practical tone, but still carrying a note of gentleness. "Tomorrow we'll pick up the files again. Rachel found some emails from your old account. We're getting closer." Odessa nodded, pulling the wool blanket from the armchair around her shoulders. She looked at him, the man who had pulled her from the freezing bus station, and now stood beside her, not just as a protector, but as something closer to a companion. "Thank you, Xavier," she said, her voice quiet but full of sincerity. "Not just for all of this, but for everything." He turned to her, his gaze tender but steady. "Don't thank me," he said, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Just keep being strong. That's all I need." She smiled, truly smiled, though it was small. And when she stood to go to her room, the fire still burned behind them, like a reminder that even in the darkest night, there was still light. The mountain house was bathed in a blood-red sunset as the last light of day slipped through the snow-laden pines, casting a still, foreboding glow. Inside, the stone fireplace threw shifting light across the oak-paneled walls, stretching the long shadows of Odessa and Xavier in the living room. Odessa sat in an armchair, hands wrapped around a mug of hot ginger tea, her blue eyes drifting over the stack of documents on the table. The evidence Xavier and his team had gathered over the past few days, threatening emails, bank transaction logs, and a preliminary report on the camera system Damon had installed in her apartment. Every page was a step forward in their fight, but also a reminder that Damon was still out there, more dangerous than ever. Xavier stood by the window, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and sharp as he spoke to Rachel, his associate attorney. "Do we have enough to file charges yet?" "Good. Prepare the filings, but keep them sealed until I give the word." He glanced over at Odessa, his deep brown eyes offering a flicker of reassurance, as if to say everything was moving in the right direction. But Odessa couldn't shake the unease coiling in her chest. She knew Damon, he wasn't the kind of man to give up, especially when he realized someone was challenging him. A sudden, hard knock struck the door, slicing through the stillness like an axe. Odessa flinched, her heart thudding wildly, fear rising like a wave she couldn't stop. Who is that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Xavier frowned, set the phone down, and stepped toward the front door. "Stay here," he said, his tone low but steady, signaling her not to move. He peered through the small window in the door, and his face hardened into steel. Without a word, he unlatched it, and Damon Hawk appeared in the doorway, tall in a black suit, blonde hair perfectly slicked back, a cold smile on his lips. Xavier, Damon said, his voice smooth but razor-edged, like a snake preparing to strike. I know you're not fond of surprises, but I thought we should talk. Without waiting for an invitation, he stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the living room until it landed on Odessa. She froze, her fingers clenching the mug so tightly it nearly cracked. Damon's smile widened, but there wasn't a shred of warmth in it. Odessa, my dear, you look more worn than I remember. His voice oozed false concern. I've come to take you home. She pressed back into the chair, as if she could disappear into it. Memories of Damon standing too close, his voice whispering threats against her skin, crashed into her like a tide. She trembled. Xavier stepped forward, planting himself solidly between them, his tall frame a barrier she couldn't see past. You're not welcome here, Xavier said, his voice cold as ice, utterly unmoved. Say what you came to say, then leave. Damon chuckled softly and pulled a folder from his inside pocket, extending it with a graceful flick of his wrist. Relax, Carter. I came to resolve this civilly. He turned to Odessa, his eyes sharp as blades. Odessa, sign this, and I'll let you go. A waiver of all claims. No lawsuits, no trouble. I'll even leave your family alone. Odessa stared at the folder, her hands shaking so badly she set the mug down before she dropped it. Let me go, she echoed, her voice cracking. You never let me go. Memories of all the times he had threatened her, all the times he had controlled her every breath, flooded back. Her hand reached shakily for a pen on the table, but her fingers trembled so badly she couldn't grasp it. Tears welled in her eyes, and she felt herself slipping back into the cage she had tried so hard to escape. Xavier stepped in swiftly but with calm control, standing right in front of her and blocking Damon from her view. He leaned down, gently took the pen from her hand, and set it back on the table, his movement firm but tender. Then he turned to Damon, his brown eyes as sharp as a blade. She's not signing, he said, his voice cold and lethal, each word a clean cut. And if you keep pushing this, I'll file suit first thing tomorrow morning. Every piece of evidence, emails, the cameras, the bank transactions is ready. You should leave, now. Damon tilted his head, the smile frozen on his face, but a flicker of anger passed through his eyes. You're making a mistake, Xavier, he said, his voice dropping low and dangerous. You'll regret crossing me. Xavier didn't so much as flinch. His gaze locked on Damon's with unblinking certainty. No, he replied, his voice clipped and strong, like the strike of a gavel. The one who'll regret this is you. The air in the room tightened to a breaking point. Damon's eyes flicked from Xavier to Odessa, as though calculating his next move. Finally, he gave a cold, humorless laugh, turned and walked to the door. We'll see each other again, he said, his voice echoing as the door closed behind him. Odessa collapsed back into the chair, her breaths coming ragged and fast. The tears she'd been fighting finally spilled over. She wrapped her arms around herself, unable to keep the sobs from escaping raw, helpless, and full of shame. Xavier turned back to her, lowered himself to one knee in front of her, his face softening but still unshakably steady. He's gone, he said, his voice low and reassuring. You're safe. She lifted her tear-filled eyes to him. I thought I would sign, she whispered, her voice small and shaking with humiliation. I was so afraid I thought it was the only way. Xavier laid a warm, grounding hand on her shoulder. But you didn't sign, he said, his voice deep and strong. You're stronger than you think, Odessa, and I'll be here to remind you of that every time you need it. She nodded, tears still slipping down her cheeks. But this time, there was a small measure of relief in her chest. You're watching Soul Stories, exclusive to our channel. If you're still with us, drop a comment we read and cherish them all. Subscribe to support more heartfelt, original stories. Thanks for being part of the Soul Stories family. The mountain house glowed under the rare sunlight of a late winter morning, golden rays piercing the thin mist and making the melting snowdrops sparkle on the wooden roof. Inside, the living room was warm, with the fire still burning in the stone hearth, but the air carried a different tension today. On the oak table, a stack of documents lay neatly arranged. Damon's threatening emails, logs of her frozen bank transactions, and the report detailing the illegal camera system he had installed in Odessa's apartment. Every page was a piece of the plan Xavier and his team had methodically built, and today he intended to strike the decisive blow. Odessa stood by the window in a gray sweater and jeans, her long hair tied high to reveal a pale face. But in her blue eyes now glimmered a new determination. She no longer cowered as she had in the beginning, though her hands still gripped the hem of her sweater as if clinging to the last scraps of her courage. Xavier sat at the table, double-checking his laptop, his deep brown eyes focused but unable to completely conceal the strain. "Today is important," he said, his voice low and clear. "Rachel will release the files to the press at noon. Everything we've gathered, the emails, the transactions, the cameras, will come to light. Damon won't be able to deny it." Odessa turned, her gaze wavering between fear and hope. "If we do this, how will he react?" she asked, her voice quiet but no longer trembling. "He won't give up easily." Xavier rose and came closer to her, his eyes locking onto hers. "He'll try to fight back," he said firmly. "But we have the evidence, and I have the best team. He'll be humiliated in public, and that's what he fears most." He touched her shoulder lightly, an anchoring gesture. "Do you want to say anything to the press? You don't have to, but if you want to, this is your chance to take back your voice." She took a deep breath, her heart pounding. The thought of standing in front of cameras before the world made her want to run. But she remembered all the days Damon had controlled her, all the threats, all the times he'd made her feel like she was nothing more than something that belonged to him. She clenched her hands and nodded. "I want to speak," she said, her voice small but steady. "I don't want him thinking I'm still afraid." Xavier smiled a rare, proud smile. "Good," he said. "I'll be right next to you." The press conference was held in a downtown hotel where camera flashes filled the conference room with bursts of white light. Rachel, Xavier's associate, stood at the podium, her voice sharp and professional as she read the statement. "Damon Hawk has used unlawful tactics to control and threaten Miss Odessa Hartley, including unauthorized surveillance, bank account restrictions, and written threats. We have filed suit in court, and we call on the public to stand on the side of justice." A wave of whispers swept through the reporters. Some raised their hands to ask questions, but Rachel gestured for Odessa to step forward. Odessa rose from the back row, her legs trembling, but her steps steady. Xavier walked beside her, his presence a silent support that kept her from falling apart. She wore a white blouse and tailored trousers, simple, elegant. Her hair was pulled back, revealing a face that looked resolved at last. Standing before the microphone, she blinked at the camera flashes, but took a breath and began to speak, her voice wavering only at the start. "My name is Odessa Hartley," she began, her tone soft but clear. "I was controlled, threatened, and stripped of my freedom by Damon Hawk. But today I am here to say that I am not anyone's property." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the crowd until it landed on Xavier. He nodded, a small gesture, but enough to help her go on. "I'm not afraid anymore. I won't let him decide who I am." For one instant, the conference room was silent. Then it erupted in applause and a flurry of shouted questions. Odessa stepped back, her breathing ragged, but a small, genuine smile spread across her lips for the first time. She felt truly powerful. Within hours, the story was everywhere. On newspaper front pages, splashed across social media. The photo of Odessa standing at the microphone, her voice steady, was shared again and again. Articles began to question Damon's reputation, and his PR team couldn't smother the rising tide of outrage. Rumors spread that Damon had canceled all his public appearances, withdrawn from the media, and even left the city to escape the backlash. For the first time, he was no longer the invincible predator, but a man losing control before the world. Back at the mountain house, Odessa sat on the sofa, replaying the news clips on Xavier's laptop. She was still shaking, but this time from relief mixed with exhilaration. The firelight painted her face in soft gold, and her blue eyes looked brighter than they ever had, as if part of the weight had finally lifted. Xavier came in carrying 2 mugs of hot cocoa, setting one gently in front of her. He sat down across from her, his deep gaze warm with a softness she rarely saw. "You did it," he said, his voice low and proud. "Today you took your voice back." Not everyone can do that. Odessa bowed her head, her fingers tracing the rim of the mug, the heat sinking into her palms. I'm not sure I did anything, she said, her voice small but sincere. But if you hadn't been here, I never would have had the courage to stand up. She looked up, tears in her eyes but steady. Without another word, she stood, walked over to him, and wrapped her arms around him. Her body was small against his, but her embrace was strong, like she was holding on to something bigger than gratitude. Xavier froze for a moment, then folded his arms around her, gentle but unyielding. You don't have to thank me, he said, his voice rough. I only did what was right. She stepped back, meeting his eyes, the tears still falling, but they were no longer tears of fear. Why did you do all this? She asked, her voice unsteady. You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. Why risk everything for me? Xavier was silent for a moment, his gaze drifting to the window where the red sunset was fading. When he looked back, there was an old pain in his eyes and he didn't try to hide it. Years ago, he began, his voice low and deliberate, I knew someone trapped in a relationship like yours. She begged me for help, but I was young, too consumed by my career, and I thought she could get out on her own. I was wrong. She never got out. She took her own life, and I've lived with that regret ever since. He paused, his gaze steady, unshakable. I'm helping you because I can't lose another person, and because you deserve to live free. Odessa blinked, tears sliding down her cheeks, but she smiled a real smile, small but genuine. She reached for his hand, squeezed it gently, as if to say thank you without words. I don't know how I could ever repay you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Xavier shook his head, a faint, quiet smile curving his lips. Just keep being yourself, he said. That's enough. She nodded, still holding his hand, and in the soft glow of the firelight, they sat together, saying nothing else. But the silence between them no longer felt heavy. It was the silence of two people who had found each other in the storm and together had begun to build something new. A year had passed, and spring sunlight flooded through the tall glass windows of the mountain house. Outside, the pines no longer wore snow, but shimmered in lush green, swaying in the gentle breeze. Inside, the kitchen was filled with the rich aroma of fresh coffee and toasted bread. Odessa stood at the counter, wearing one of Xavier's oversized white shirts, her long hair loosely tied back to reveal a radiant face no longer haunted by fear. She was slicing strawberries, the bright red pieces falling onto a plate as a soft melody drifted from the small speaker on the shelf. She hummed along, her voice clear and bright, and for the first time in years her smile carried no burden. Damon Hawk was nothing more than a ghost in her past. After the press conference that exposed all his threats, his reputation collapsed like a sandcastle. The lawsuits that followed with the undeniable evidence Xavier and his team had built cost Damon nearly everything. His power, his respect, and finally his freedom as he faced criminal charges. Odessa never looked back. She had returned to the work she loved, freelance graphic design, and little by little had reclaimed her confidence. Each project she completed was proof that she had found herself again, and now her gaze held only hope in Xavier. Xavier stepped into the kitchen, his black hair slightly mussed, wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans. He paused in the doorway, his deep brown eyes fixed on her with an unguarded tenderness. Are you destroying my kitchen? He asked, teasing, though his eyes lit up when she laughed. Destroying? Odessa shot back, feigning indignation as she lifted the paring knife. I'm elevating it, Mr. Carter. She set the knife down, picked up a slice of strawberry and popped it into her mouth, her gaze mischievous. Want to try? My masterpiece. He smiled a rare, radiant smile and stepped closer. Instead of taking a berry, he slipped his arms around her waist, pulling her gently against him. I don't need strawberries, he murmured, his voice husky, full of meaning. I already have the sweetest thing right here. Odessa laughed, the sound ringing pure and bright through the warm kitchen. She leaned her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, and in that moment, she knew she had finally found her true home, not just a refuge, but a place where she could be herself without fear, without hiding. You're such a sap, she said, her tone teasing, though her eyes shone with love. Xavier dipped his head, brushing his mouth against hers in a kiss that was deep and unhurried, filled with the trust they had built over all the months together. She kissed him back, her hand sliding around his neck, pulling him closer as if she never wanted to let go. The kiss was long, sweet as strawberries, warm as the spring sunlight, and when they finally parted, both were smiling, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "You're distracting me," Xavier said, mock serious, though he still hadn't let her go. "I was going to get some work done, but now all I want is to stay here with you all day." "Then stay," she replied, her eyes bright. "Work can wait, but the strawberries can't." A year later, on a brilliant summer afternoon, the mountain house was decorated simply but beautifully for a special occasion. Strings of twinkling lights hung across the porch, and a small reception table was set up in the yard, where the pines circled them like a dream. Odessa and Xavier's wedding was anything but extravagant, just their closest loved ones. Xavier's parents smiled warmly and hugged them tight. Odessa's mother wiped away tears at the sight of her daughter so luminous. Her little sister Lily ran around in a bright floral dress. Odessa wore a simple white gown, nothing like the elaborate dress she'd worn on the day she ran away from Damon, but it made her feel free, beautiful, and completely herself. As she walked toward Xavier, he stood waiting in a gray suit, his deep brown eyes on her like she was the only thing in the world. He had proposed months earlier, on a quiet evening in the same kitchen where they'd shared so many moments. He'd knelt with a simple silver ring in hand and said, "Odessa, you're the reason I believe in good things. Will you be my wife?" She had cried and nodded, wrapping her arms around him, knowing there was nowhere safer than in his arms. Now as they spoke their vows, her voice was clear even through her tears. "Xavier, thank you for everything, for giving me a place to come home to, a reason to smile, and a future to believe in." She smiled, radiant, tears glinting on her cheeks, but these were tears of happiness. Xavier took her hand, his gaze never leaving hers. "Odessa, you are my light," he said, his voice low and full of feeling. "I promise to spend my life protecting your smile." When they exchanged rings and kissed under the summer sun, applause and laughter rose from their family. Lily rushed to hug her sister, and Odessa's mother wiped her eyes, whispering to Xavier's mother that the two of them had found each other like it was fate. The wedding ended with a simple meal, strawberry cake, and warm conversation. But for Odessa, the most beautiful moment was when she stood beside Xavier, hand in hand, looking out over the pine forest, and knew she was finally truly free.